Okay, well, good morning, fellas. MTI podcast, interesting topic today. What does it mean to be a good dad? What got me going on this topic is a couple things. Met with an old friend here in Wyoming, and just for a beer or whatever. And he has a teenage son. His son made a mistake, and his father took it really personal. And it led into the discussion, of did he let his son down as a father? He was really surprised by this. How responsible are we for our kids' mistakes? And it got me thinking about this idea of what is a good dad. And then just on way back I drove down to Ogden this week and worked with Jim down there a little bit. And on the way back up, just happened to listen to a podcast, and there was a podcast about fatherhood that kind of came up unexpectedly, and the roles of fatherhood, and how important we as dads can be in our child's lives. And it made me think about this topic, and got home and did some research. And so I sent y'all a bunch of lightning round questions, and we're going to get right into it with some of these hard questions, then do some discussion, and then come back to these lightning round questions. So let's just go around the horn. The first lightning round question is if you can be a good dad if you're not a good provider. And I'll answer first. I'm not sure you can be. I think one of the big roles, at least in my mind, of being a good dad is that you're taking care of your family financially, and home, shelter just lends a bit of stability and safety that I think is essential and a big role of being a good dad. Charlie, you're next. What do you think?
Yes.
Can you be a good dad if you're not a good provider? And your answer is yes?
Yep.
Dan.
No, I'm more in agreement with you, Rob. I think it's a hard no. You cannot be.
Derek.
Yeah, I think without a good base, a good stable area to kind of raise a family on, it's going to be tough. So whether that's coming from you or the mom, I think the family needs it, depending on your situation.
Second question, how easy or hard is it for you to build an emotional connection with your kids? Yeah, boy, how do you define emotional connection? Sometimes my kids talk about stuff, they seem so different from me that it's pretty hard to have a conversation. So it's very difficult for me. Charlie.
I've got a 7-year-old, so it's easy so far. Although I would expect that to change down the road. Or change, at least.
Dan.
Yeah, I think it ebbs and flows. For context, I've got the soon-to-be 14-year-old girl, 20-year-old son, and there's been varying times where it's stronger with one than the other. So it's very difficult, but for me, the older the son has gotten, it's been easier. Whereas my daughter's getting older, it's harder to maintain that with her.
Got it. Derek.
Yeah, my kids are on the younger age still at 10 and 6 years old, and both boys. And it was harder for me at the beginning. And then once I understood that it's on me to find the connection and not on them to come meet me wherever I'm at, I think it got a little bit better.
Yeah, interesting. Can't expect your 7-year-old or whatever to talk about what's going on in your life. Number 4, how responsible are you as a father for your kids' successes or failures? And here I'm talking about their successes in art, in their work, in academics, in sports. I think other than just adding that stability, given my lack of talent, any success I think kids have is probably not because of me. So I don't think we're very responsible. I guess in my mind, it's pretty much on the kids and their own talents and gifts. Charlie, your thoughts?
I think parents are enablers, but certainly not responsible for successes and or failures.
Dan.
Two-part answer is one, obviously, you got to define what the success is and whether they've achieved it. But I think there just becomes an age limit where you're more responsible for them being successful at younger ages, and kind of thinking of the brackets that the research had in ages is you could go just easily say maybe at 18 years and beyond, you're less responsible for their successes or failures.
Derek.
Yeah, I think I'm along the lines of you guys where I'm not going to take full responsibility for my kids' successes, and I'm also not going to do it for their failures. I think it's on us as we kind of build that base and the stability and kind of give them and get out of their way to make their own people. And I'm sure all you have seen it as well with just how different your kids are. You try to give them a very similar type upbringing, and then they're succeeding and failing in all different types of parts of life on their own.
Yeah, next question. Can you be a good father if you're personally unhappy? My answer is it's difficult, if not impossible. Hard to pour from an empty cup. Charlie.
Yeah, I would agree there.
Dan.
The short answer is I think yes, you can be. I don't think you're going to be potentially a great or slightly more than good father. But it kind of goes back to earlier. If you're still providing, albeit unhappy, I think you're still a good father.
Derek.
Yeah, same as Dan. I think you can be a good father. You're not going to be great, though. I think there's just so much that you can give, and I'm right there.
Any major differences you've noticed between raising sons and daughters? I have 3 sons and 1 daughter, and she's the youngest. And it's a whole different ball game with her. I guess not a whole different ball game. She is definitely feminine, but she really likes to wrestle. So a little bit of both. But in terms of treating them different, I'm pretty consistent in the way I've treated them. But so she's so young, perhaps, for me to notice. She's just 5. Charlie.
Well, I only have a son, so I can't say for sure, but we've got a bunch of girls in the neighborhood that are around Luke's age, and they're over at the house all the time. And it certainly looks from the outside like an entirely different beast.
Dan.
Yes, I could talk on this one for a while, but it won't. I just think that the one I'd highlight the major difference is just the emotional, or even just a better word is just the communication. Far easier for me to have conversations, deep conversations, sports conversations with my son, because I think we have more of a shared interest, and I have shared interests with my daughter, but it's just different communication with her. I can't connect as well as I do with him.
What do you think are the father's top 3 responsibilities, and how would you rank them in priority? I guess it's number 1 for me would be provider. Number 2 is to keep the mom happy. And then if you have a happy mom, it's easier to have happy kids. And then number 3, I think for me, is to serve the role of letting the kids know what's possible in terms of adventure, career. In other words, just that idea of let them know kind of what's possible in this world. So those are my 3 and the priorities. Go ahead, Charlie.
I think probably first and foremost is just loving your kid. That's not necessarily a innate thing, and telling them so. It's amazing. We skipped over the question, but there was a question you sent earlier about strengths and weaknesses of your own dads. And my parents split when I was a baby. So I grew up in a split house. My dad was pretty far away for most of my life. And you certainly see in others a lack of love, and you see the difference it makes in the kid. I think it's huge. And then I think everything outside of that is things that you do to enable your own children in terms of encouraging them and giving them confidence and all those other things. I think that that's a kind of a big catch-all. So I would just list those 2: loving them and letting them know that you do, and being the enabler in a variety of different functions to kind of let them flourish.
Dan.
Yeah, I kind of want to change what I had in my prep, but I'm not going to. I'll stick with the 3 that I started with in prep. And same was provide food, shelter, health. Second, I said example setting and behaviors and values. And then the 3rd thing I put in there was education of life skills. That's a very broad 3rd one, but just educating your children.
Derek.
Yeah, I've been kind of kicking this one around for a little bit too. And the fact that some of the research that you sent kind of goes into this as well, but trying to give them a solid emotional underpinning, like trying to talk to them in the right ways, that they're building that inner voice of theirs where they believe in themselves, where they feel safe and protected, and where they find themselves capable. I've been trying to think a little bit more about that. And I think that's really important, is providing an emotional underpinning. So that'd be my number 1. Providing the example, right? You're going out and doing all the things that you think a man should do in the world, and being the person that you want to be. So giving them the example would be my number 2. And then I'm not sure exactly how it fits, but as far as like within all 3 of them, but protection, right? Giving them that stability of where they can be, where they feel safe, and where they can kind of build from. So those are my top 3.
Thanks for pointing that out, Charlie. I didn't mean to skip over that question. What are the strengths and weaknesses of your own dad, and how has that influenced your approach to fatherhood? I can't answer this. My dad was killed when I was really young, and my mom didn't remarry until I was well out of the house. So, Charlie.
Certainly, like I mentioned, it was kind of a distance relationship for a while, for probably the formative years. So I guess just a weakness is just, physically being around. We had a great relationship, but it just wasn't there, So I guess you could call that a weakness. Strength, he's to this day the best listener I've ever come across, and that's a valuable skill as a human being, I think, and particularly as our relationship was maybe just a little non-traditional because he was pretty far away. The ability to listen and serve as a springboard for ideas over the last 37 years has been really valuable for me. Something I appreciate that he does really well and kind of does it in a non-judgmental way.
Nice, Dan.
Yes, interesting because some similarities to Charlie. So for a weakness, for context, my parents got divorced when I was in third grade, and my dad was kind of out of the picture. I mean, he was around, but I don't know if he was embarrassed or what, but didn't have a lot of presence really from third grade and then until I started college. So I've constantly used his weakness of not having presence to model my behavior, to not do that as best as I could as a father. But on the strength side, he was a guidance counselor and coached multiple high school sports. Damn good at it, in my opinion. And I think I've carried that forward, specifically in my military life, whether that be through counseling, mentorship, guidance to teammates, etc. So that was his strength that I've definitely captured and continued, at least in my viewpoint.
Derek.
Yeah, I'd say my dad's biggest strength was being there. And I was the oldest of four kids, very involved in sports. That's kind of like where my connection with my dad came in. But he grew up wrestling, in the middle of Iowa. And I wrestled as well, but I wanted to do a whole bunch of other sports. And he had no idea what any of those were about, like ice hockey and things like that. But he learned real quick, and he became the coach of all the teams and became super involved in everything. And so that's kind of where our connection flourished. And so his life revolved around his kids, and he put everything into that. And so that's certainly influenced the way that I try to connect with my kids, and I try to be there and be present. As I've grown older, and I didn't really see this as a kid, but I could see as a potential weakness was that he didn't have a lot of personal hobbies or things going on outside of his family. And so I could see maybe sometimes he wasn't as happy as he might have been, or if he maybe he could have given a little bit more in some of the other ways, like emotional availability or showing his passion for other things kind of outside of that.
Interesting. Your kids let you down, make a mistake, get in trouble, your fault or theirs. Boy, this is a hard one. I think, and I was thinking about this. Of course, I reflected back to the conversation I had with my friend. But then also, you'll see this in social media too, or news. Some kid will do something and they'll blame the parents. There was a case, I forget where it was, a school shooting, and I think the parents were arrested because he bought the rifle or something like that. So anyway. It's just interesting how that goes back and forth. Yeah, my answer on this is a more difficult question. I guess it depends on the age. The younger they are, perhaps not, but the older they are, maybe a little more responsibility. And I'm assuming the kids are still in the home for this question. Charlie?
I think not responsible, particularly as they age. It's the same kind of concept as I'm not going to take credit for any of his successes. I don't think you can take credit for any of the failures. Now, your example that's an extremist, right? You leave a gun unlocked and it's used for something terrible or whatever the case may be. That's a different deal. But I think generally you just try and lay down the framework of the principles to hopefully guide their life, but their decisions are going to be their own. That doesn't mean that I think the reality is probably separated from the emotional component as a parent. If your kid really fucks up, you probably are still going to feel responsible to some degree.
Dan?
Yeah, this one has so many layers too. And I'm in a good bit of agreement with you, Rob, about age has something to do with it in terms of where they are. It's like we said, if the kids are still in the house to frame this one, the short answer or the upfront answer, I think it's got to be both. The parent, the father, has absolutely some responsibility for what they've instilled in them that led to that screw up. But at a certain point, you got to cut ties with feeling that responsibility or bearing that weight, and therefore it does fall on to the child or kid.
Derek?
Yeah, just like you can't take full responsibility for any success of your kids, you can't take full responsibility of their failures. But yeah, if you've set them on the wrong path, then I think the father at least has some amount of responsibility there.
Worst thing you can do as a father, I think, to really show your kid that you're super disappointed in them in a character way. In other words, even though they may make a mistake, it has to be in context, and I think showing deep disappointment would be one of the worst things you could do as a father. Charlie.
That's interesting because my mom remarried and I had a stepdad probably sixth grade, and high school era I really was in a lot of trouble with the law pretty frequently, and when he showed disappointment in character, it really actually kind of made an impact on my decision making, trying to straighten things up. So that's kind of an interesting contrast. I think the worst thing you can do is misuse or break the inherent trust that your child has in you as a father. I kind of realized this when my kid was coming out of, little baby blob phase and turning into a little child, with some real thoughts. And I had a realization. It's like, man, this little guy trusts me inherently, which really doesn't exist anywhere else in relationships. Inherent trust. Like if he were to jump off of the third story roof, he would absolutely have full confidence that I would catch him, right? And I think to misuse that trust in any way would be a pretty terrible thing to do as a parent.
Dan.
I think Charlie actually just helped me understand why I couldn't figure out why my response was what I'm going to tell you, which is I think the worst thing you can do is lie, just lying to your children. And I was trying to figure that out because I've lied to them on little things, hiding gifts or telling them that we were going to be early or late for something, so little white lies. But I didn't understand why I was thinking about lying being the worst thing, and now Charlie just made it make sense, because I think if you're a liar, you are breaking that trust that only exists between a father and a child.
Derek.
Yeah, I think actively choosing to not be a part of their life, it just leaves them without a moral compass, without an example. And obviously they may find that somewhere else, whether the mom steps in or another different male figure is available. But that's always frightened me, and something I've tried to always be there for the kids.
The best thing you can do for your kids, I guess then providing, my answer would be this idea of adventure. Let them know what's possible in all the different areas of life, whether that be work or outdoor stuff or academics or art. Exposing them and encouraging them to step out and treat life as an adventure. Charlie.
Yeah, I think, if the worst thing you can do is not be there, which I think Derek has a good point in that. I think the best thing you can do is be there. You're talking about greatest impact. Being physically and emotionally present for your kid is huge. And that's a big part of the battle. And that's kind of a pass-fail grade. So I think the best thing you could do is be there for your kid, generally, physically and emotionally.
Dan.
A bit of a traditionalist response, but for me, I went with the best thing being the example setting of the relationship with your wife. I think younger kids won't understand that marriage has highs and lows, and it can be difficult, but it's so critical to work through those and demonstrate a healthy relationship with the wife throughout their upbringing and then even beyond once they're out of the house. So if you can do that well, I think that's the best thing you can do as a man, as a father.
Derek.
I'd say after being there, if you're able to instill a sense of self-confidence in them, I think that sets their path on a really positive trajectory, because they're just going to believe that they can do things. They're going to believe that they're capable. So whether that goes down into using them to help you do stuff and making them believe they're super strong or super fast or whatever it is, I think that's going to help them out.
How has fatherhood changed you personally? I think that what fatherhood has done for me is just brought so much joy to my life. I don't know that there's ever been anything that's great as hanging out with kids. I don't know if that's selfish or whatever, but I know that I've talked to young couples who have thought about not having kids because they said they were selfish about their own stuff. I'm like, the most selfish thing you could do is have kids, because they bring you so much joy. So yeah, I think it's brought me joy in ways. Is I'm kind of a hard ass, head down, ass up grinder, and hanging out with my kids has just brought me so much joy. So, that would be one for me. Charlie.
Yeah, Rob was really the one who convinced me to have kids and did it in a convincing fashion. So I owe you for that one. I was pretty indifferent on the topic at the time and growing up, but certainly it's been the best thing I've ever done. How's it changed me personally? I definitely agree, Rob, with just the joy it brings you. I think one of the more interesting ones for me has been it's made me much less. I've become much more of a pussy than I was, I think is the best way to put it. My worst fear is not being able to see him grow up. And so from, what I do with my body and the choices I make with some things, there's a kind of a little fear in there that didn't exist before. And that exists with kind of the physical component, but it also exists with, finances and all that kind of stuff and the decision making that goes behind that.
Dan.
Yeah, for me, it changed me personally as it gave me a greater sense of accountability. I think marriage didn't change the way I approached life significantly. I was still kind of high and loose and not really worried about any type of consequences, whether that be consequence on myself or something that I would do physically, financially, in the military, whatever it may be. And as soon as kids entered, I was much more accountable for my actions, whether that was kind of like to something you guys have already said about not being there because of something I did, or getting in trouble that would cause a bad example for them or further impact to them. So definitely a greater sense of accountability.
Derek.
I think for me, it gave me a lot more patience and a lot more empathy. It made me understand a little bit further, more so than what marriage or anything else could do, is just how inherently different people are and how it doesn't even matter what kind of situation you're coming from. There's just like these inherent characteristics of everyone else, and being able to be there and watch those little developments day by day and just seeing these little people form gave me just a greater sense of how vast the world is and how different people can be. And it gave me a lot more patience for that.
Your biggest strength as a father, I guess for me, is probably just being a provider, and that'd probably be my biggest strength. Charlie.
Yeah, I think, you take a look at your own parents and try and emulate their strengths and try and improve upon their weaknesses. And, for my own father, like I mentioned, he's a wonderful listener and has wonderful empathy. And those are two things that I work really hard to be good at. And I think that's a strength. We'll see if that lasts. But I think that's probably my biggest strength for my kiddo.
I'm at a tension with this one because I'm concerned that what I assess as my greatest strength may also be a decent weakness, and that's patience. I'm very patient with both of my kids, and as I watch them still continue to grow, I wonder if I've been too patient at times and not pushed them harder or applied more discipline because I'm allowing them more time or more space to grow. So I don't know, but that one I think patience could be a weakness, but I do think it's also my strength for them.
Derek.
I think I do a pretty good job of setting the example for them in the way that I kind of approach problems in life. And so I'd say that's my best strength.
The next one is your biggest weakness. For me, it's probably the emotional connection and communication. Not a very, very good communicator. Charlie.
Probably patience. Dan's strength is my weakness. I think I could work on being a little bit more patient. I have a tendency to want to get shit done quickly, and I think that could be improved upon in terms of how I approach my kid.
Dan.
Yeah, I don't think I push them hard enough. Whether it's to their goals or education, finding different purposes in what they're doing, I just don't think I push them hard enough.
And Derek.
I'm right on the same page as you, Rob, with the communication, especially kind of in some of the more emotional aspects and finding the connection through things that are other than activities. I struggle.
So that's the end of the lightning questions. Now we'll kind of talk about some of the different areas of research found, and then come back and see if each of our answers has changed the way we think, and then revisit the questions at the end. And the first kind of stuff I sent you is the current research say about being a good dad. Emotional engagement is a big problem or a big thing. They said if you're emotionally engaged with your kids, they have higher self-esteem, better social confidence, presence over provision. So this tension of being a provider versus being there, especially for Derek and Dan. I understand inherently the demands of being military officers. A lot of 12, 16-hour days, deployments, so you're not around a lot or can't be, especially if you're in, like Dan's coming off command, or has been in command. And so that's one for sure that I wonder about. Encourager and challenger. I thought this one was the most interesting. Fathers provide unique contribution of encouraging, risk-taking, and independence. Just in my relationships with my two wives, I was the one who would, grab the kids and, go backpacking and do outside stuff and kind of push in those directions. And then modeling behaviors. Several of you mentioned this. I don't know that there's anything unique here, except it seemed that the research has changed and pointed towards the emotional responsibility of the father, other than some of that other stuff. Any thoughts from you guys kind of on just that really quick research summary? Any disagreements with that or the way they put it out there? Go ahead, Charlie, and I'll start with you. Anything to comment on that kind of section of the research?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that kind of the presence over provision component. That's why I answered no to the first question. Is I think you can, if you're there, you're doing 80% of the job, right? And by there, I mean physical and emotional. So, if that's the biggest pass-fail component of it, then I think you can be in a variety of different potentially financial circumstances. I mean, there's, I think, a pretty good case study to be made that folks who come from challenging circumstances develop a certain kind of grit that aren't necessarily seen if you're coming from the behind the ivory tower concept, whatever that looks like for each individual. So that's why I think it's just the emotional presence, physical presence is so damn important.
Any other comments from Dan or Derek on kind of what research has shown here?
Yeah, I just want to add the one thing, and it was on the same category I got stuck on as Charlie, which was the provision versus presence, because I guess I'd say what I thought something that could be missing from this focus on presence is a father's responsibility for emergency or like crisis management. And I'm using a little bit of my own bias here. Like one of the hardest things for me about military or specifically deployments is the fear of not being there. Kid get hospitalized, hit by a car. And I think it's critical that a father is there for those events to demonstrate the example, care for the kid in crisis and emergency. And so I guess to summarize it all up, what I'm saying is I do see the importance of presence as it relates to reacting to crisis or emergency. Just kind of further qualifying that, if you will.
Derek.
Yeah, I really enjoyed seeing the different research that is out there. And I think I'm probably on one of the younger sides. I'm 37 years old. So a lot of this kind of like turned towards the father being more involved emotionally. And much to my chagrin, sometimes that seems to be a much greater emphasis, and maybe something that we didn't grow up with our dads or certainly with our grandparents. And so every time I see it, I just kind of see where I'm able to be a little bit more available and where I'm able to kind of connect more in that way. Because it's definitely one of the weaknesses of mine.
So let me give you a scenario. I remember talking to a father one time, and we were saying it was during a financial crisis. I'm like, hey, I'll work, 7 different jobs. I have no pride. I'll do whatever it takes to provide for my family. And then on the other end, you'll have people who are in careers that just don't pay well. For example, in the world I've worked with, a lot of mountain guides, and it doesn't pay well. It's contract work. It's seasonal. You're gone a lot, and they'd have kids and kind of would struggle financially. They loved their job. They were at the highest level of their career profession. They were IMGA, internationally certified guides, guided all over the world, but just difficult to provide for the family when you're in an occupation that for whatever reason just doesn't pay very well. What do you think about that idea that would it be, as you look back on your careers, if you decided you weren't providing well for your family, would you change your career for something you love to provide?
I'll say short answer is yes. I go back to it having to be where I rank the responsibility of a father versus kind of my happiness. So if I was in something that I enjoyed, but they were sucking, then I think I'm doing it wrong. And I would have to change gears, go down the road of something else that was providing for them, even if it wasn't something I enjoyed. I think you have to as a dad.
Yeah, I think I would too, even along the lines of not only financial provision, but if the profession that you've chosen isn't allowing you to be there. I think about this a lot with the military. I think if anything was going to, kind of sway my decision to get out of the military, it would be if it was really negatively affecting my kids. And up to this point, I've been lucky in that it hasn't. I haven't been there all the time, but it's provided a good enough life and enough stability for them, I think, to flourish.
This is ironic, though, right? Because I know I've had conversations with my wife at multiple points in my military career where I debated choosing another track. And her default was always like, you'll be miserable in anything else. She was more along the lines of, I don't want you to be miserable, and we can figure out a way, to make do. And we were never in any type of crisis like that. But it's funny to think that she was wanting me not to be a miserable sack of shit just for a different job.
I think I'd side with your wife there on this one. I guess it really depends on, how you define being a provider. My assumption with your example, Rob, I think I know exactly what you're talking about, is do you have a roof over your head? If yes, that's a check. It's kind of the difference between day-to-day financial stability and maybe long-term financial stability, and how you approach and look at that, what that actually means. That probably means something different to a host of different people. But, I've just seen so many examples from my own childhood of dads who were absolutely fucking miserable in their job, good providers, but absolutely miserable in their jobs, and they were kind of shit dads because of it. So I think I would go with, as long as the major components of life are covered, you've got shelter and you've got food and those kinds of things, you have access to medical care, I think you're checking the big blocks. If your retirement account isn't where it needs to be, well, you can deal with that when your kid's older, right? You have catch up time, but you got a long life, but you only have a limited amount of time as a impactful parent. And I think doing something you enjoy that still kind of gets those basic building blocks of life covered, I think that's a worthwhile sacrifice, because it's really just the difference between necessities and
Yeah, as I think about this, especially for military members with your duty station changes, it's pretty difficult to have double incomes if your wife's following you around, right? And so that's an automatic, for many military members, that's an automatic decrease in income for the family, which is kind of interesting. I know the father I was referring to earlier, his father wasn't around because he's working all the time, which is, another interesting element. In the case of, the guide case, if they're living in a town like Jackson, it's pretty impossible to buy a house here, just based on, this is where their work is, but it's pretty possible to buy a house on that salary. So there's all these different ideas if you can't buy a house, and the financial security that comes with that. Any other thoughts about this? I guess we're going to talk a little bit more about this. I wonder, as I read through this, the expanded role of being emotionally available, what that means, if that's just part of the kind of the new age research or direction. In other words, the research maybe didn't find that, but that's what the researchers wanted, so they kind of found it in their bias. I can't really speak to this, but I think Charlie said, I don't know, you said your dad was always a good communicator, but did get divorced. Dan, you're a divorced kid, or you grew up with a divorced family, right? Derek, your dad was around. What about the emotional stuff that they talk about? Do you think, I get just comment on that from your perspective. Did you think growing up that your dad was there emotionally? Maybe the word emotional connection isn't the right word, because emotion doesn't try to capture it. Just any thoughts on that idea of I guess, the emotional connection? Presence, I guess, and there's a difference between presence over provision, right? Just being there and then being emotionally connected are two different steps. I guess you could be there and not be emotionally connected. Go ahead, Dan, jump in.
Yeah, this one's super interesting to me because I guess I'll start off by saying I don't know how important the emotional connection really is as it relates to being a good father. I'll start off with that. As I try to reflect back, I mean, I didn't, because of being from a divorced family, I didn't have an emotional connection with my dad for a very long time at the, grade school, high school time frame. And even then, when we started reconnecting in college, didn't it didn't grow as much. So I defaulted to my grandfather and his two sons, my two uncles. And they have set more examples for me, and I mean, I've carried their behaviors, the love for the outdoors from my time with them. There was no emotion from them either. It was kind of just about doing work ethic, getting out, doing things, and I never shared things emotionally with them. In my opinion, maybe I'm thinking too soft about emotional, but I am a little surprised by how much is in the research because I'll cap it off by saying I think the emotional connection for children is more important for the mother. But maybe that's just again my traditional mindset. I don't know. I don't think the emotional connection is as critical to being a quality successful father.
Do you think it makes you, maybe it's a selfish thing, and it makes you enjoy being a father more, being able to kind of be emotionally available and making that emotional connection versus like a very cut and dry relationship with your kid? Maybe it's a selfish thing instead of and it doesn't really matter for the kid.
I For me, I think it is selfish because what I think it is for just me, my own perspective is just, it's a defense mechanism. Um, I don't think I want to be. I don't think I want to be as emotionally connected with them because I guess subconsciously is what I'm saying. It's not that I'm not emotionally connected. It's that I fear being too far down the road of emotionally connected that it would cause me to do my job less effectively, maybe while I'm away. Um, I, I, yeah, it goes back to thinking. I remember, my mindset typically was I tried as best as I could to forget about my family once you get on a plane to go somewhere. And it sounds weird, but I just didn't want them clouding decisions in the moment while overseas. So kind of unpacking myself a little bit here, but I think that might be where it comes from.
Yeah, in this section that they have like presence and then emotional connection, they're separate. So presence is spending quality time, showing affection, and listening. I guess I, hindsight, try to spend quality time, show affection, try to listen, but I don't know that I'm a great listener. And then the emotional engagement is a separate component. Gosh, I don't even know what does that mean, emotional engagement. Derek, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think my mind always goes back to how to men connect with each other, and how do I do that with my boys? And a lot of that comes through play and activity, not necessarily the sitting down and looking at each other in the eyes and talking about how we felt when we woke up in the morning, but it's being in the backyard and throwing the ball around or roughhousing, around the house. And so I think that for me is where I've found my niche with my boys in being able to connect with them. And I hear things from them like, oh, we just love playing with dad, or we love it when we're able to do that together. And I think, like Dan was saying, my wife definitely connects more verbally and talking to them, talking through things, and having that engagement. And so maybe it's just a difference between the genders here and how we connect with each other.
I try to really focus on the listening component because obviously the example of my dad had given me, because he is such a good listener, and I don't know where that is on the emotional spectrum, but he does it in a way that's completely non-judgmental, which is a wonderful thing, and it has allowed our adult relationship to really flourish. He's certainly my closest confidant now, and that's something like I'm actively trying to set the groundwork for now with my kid, because I would love to have that I would love to have the same relationship with my son that I have with my dad now. And so I think I'm probably similar to you guys, where it's like not necessarily a natural feeling thing. It's something I really have to try pretty hard at, because you want to tell, I think inherently you want to say, do this, not that, do this, not that. But sometimes just being able to be the trusted sounding board, maybe is valuable and potentially plants those seeds for a life of that kind of relationship.
Yeah, I think that is important. I read here that modern research shows that provision is not enough. Fathers provide financial security, but are emotionally absent, often have weaker bonds with their children. And if you take that out later on, right? And Charlie, it seems that you still have a great relationship with your dad. And if you had an itchy, he'd be the first one you'd call. I think we all want that when we're, with our own kids in their 30s. So I worry about my lack of listening skills maybe, and what those relationships will be with my children as they grow older, because we lose them, right? We only have them for so long. Any more thoughts about this idea? I guess it's kind of interesting. There's a section here of the traditional role versus the modern expanded role. And the modern expanded role is nurturer and emotional supporter. And I read that, I'm like, that sounds like the mom. I hope it's not on me. Any more thoughts about this idea of the emotional stuff?
I just want to add one thing that popped into my head listening to everybody talk. I guess maybe I am more emotionally connected than I didn't give myself credit for, because it comes in different ways. And just as an example, like my son who's away at college now, he calls his mom about once a day for various reasons. Sometimes it's just to bullshit with her. I don't know what it is. He and I don't talk on the phone unless he needs something, but we are constantly sending texts on sports updates or even training things that he's looking at for physical training, just real quick back and forth. And I think now that I hear you guys talk, I think I am emotionally connected to him just through different means than the way I would see what Rob just mentioned as the nurturing mother. So just different ways of being connected. But when I hear emotionally connected, I guess I think it's soft, sissy stuff, but maybe it isn't.
I have a question for you guys. Go ahead, Derek. I have a question that I wanted to hear y'all's perception on, but go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Just quickly, I was working on some character and leadership development stuff on a professional project, and they were bringing in some researchers that were talking about happiness and the way that you lead an organization and the way that you lead people towards fulfillment, because with that, you hope that they would be able to do their job better, they'd be more professional, all these different things. And the number one research right now is social connection. It's like feeling like you belong and feeling that you're connected to others, whether that's in your family unit or on a part of a team or a bigger organization. And so then that starts getting me thinking about, well, connection. What does connection really mean? And maybe between a mom and their son, that comes down to just phone calls and BSing and stuff. And sometimes that connection goes to working together, solving problems together, doing things together. And so whenever I call my dad, I know it's kind of a painful conversation unless we have something to talk about. It's like, hey, I'm looking at a new truck. What's your opinion on your Tacoma? Like, oh my gosh, let me tell you all about this. And, I was at the dealership last weekend. We looked at the Ranger and we looked at this. And so then there's like a connection. There's a problem that we're going to solve together. And then it could be, a month before I call again, and that's okay. And I still feel connected.
I was curious what y'all's experiences have been, particularly in physical outlets, sports training, whatever, outdoor adventures. My kid is super resistant to me coaching him in things. And that seems to be a common thread I've seen kind of just with my friends' kids, and I'm 37 as well, and everybody has similar age kids, and it seems to be a common thread. So I was curious if that is something you guys have experienced, if it's something that evolves over time, or it's just kind of there's a natural resistance there. It doesn't exist. Interestingly, it doesn't exist with anything academic, I guess, right? So reading, writing, math, when I'm working with him on that stuff, totally open to seeing how it's kind of how to do it. But with physical stuff, sports particularly, my kiddos, I got to work something in. And then kind of just adjacent to that, this is probably more for Dan and Rob, but if you've actively sought out kind of male mentorship from others to help with that kind of thing, or just general character development. Because I certainly had some really important mentor type figures in my teenage years that were not family. So it's kind of a two-part question, but I think they're quasi-related.
Go ahead, Dan. You go first, or on this idea of your kids taking your coaching, and then we'll all go through that, and then we'll go into the idea of mentors. Go ahead, Dan, on coaching.
Sure. I don't have a reason for this, but I haven't figured it out, I guess is what I'll say, but my son couldn't hear me on anything physical related coaching as hard as I tried until he finished high school. And I don't know if that was because he stopped organized sports when he finished high school, or what. But now it's constant communication. I'm wondering, on asking me questions as it relates to his physical programming. So he's trying to, maybe because it changed, because what his goal is right now is he's trying to increase his fitness for being a firefighter in a couple of years, maybe 18 months or so, going to the academy. And he sees interest in that. But man, Charlie, I tried like hell to try to, anything from just like understanding basic form on lifting to establishing a culture of fitness. He didn't give a damn what I had to say to him. He got it from his friends and from his high school sports coaches. So Rob, I don't know if you want me to stop there or jump into the mentorship one as well, or where you want me, if you want me to go in the second part of the question, or stop.
Yeah, stop there, and then we'll come back to the mentorship. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, mine's kind of the same way. He's really into skiing, just downhill skiing, and I try to give him some tips and tricks, and he's like, "Okay, I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to do what I'm doing." And I'm like, "All right." So this year we actually got him into like a downhill racing program. So we'll see how that goes. If it can have them, some coaches from Austria straighten him out or something. Well, we'll see.
Yeah, I don't remember any of that resistance with any of my kids. I don't know, just because they did resist and I overpowered them on the small things, but on the big things like where to go to college, what to study, where you should live, they don't listen to me at all. So on the big things, they definitely don't listen, and I usually give unsolicited advice that they don't want to hear. I'll take the mentorship thing first. I never had any male mentors. I'm growing up ever. But go ahead, Dan, on mentors, male mentors other than your dad.
Yeah, 100% had multiple male mentors. It was almost tribal. And maybe it has to be because, my dad wasn't physically around. And then I just didn't want to be him after the divorce, after, what I believed or I assessed that he did to the family. So it's interesting to me because off the top of my head, I can think of 5 people that I would considered, that I do consider mentors in my grade school, high school years. Grandfather and uncles are easy, but it was also once I started working construction, and some of those guys, right, good or bad, were mentors to me as well. Even influenced my decisions to join the military, and none of them were military, which is interesting. They just had a similar work ethic. So I cap it all off to say I don't think my son has any of those now, or even did, because I was still there. So I think it's just the absence of my father caused me to have to seek out other mentors.
Derek?
Yeah, for me, it was my dad growing up, and I didn't really find my tribe per se until getting out of Iowa and then into the military and seeing different parts of the world. So since then, of course, there's been a lot of really positive mentors in my life outside of my dad.
Do you think it would be beneficial as a father to actively seek mentors for your kids? And maybe this might be a specific thing to sons, but to me, it seems like a really valuable thing to have. There's always going to be, particularly I think as they get to teenage years, Dan and Rob can probably attest to this, that there's going to be a natural resistance, kind of there wants to be a break away from the nest or whatever. So do you think it would be beneficial to actively seek out male mentors for your kids, and maybe particularly sons?
Yeah, I do. I think it is, just to jump in, I think it is valuable, and I'm questioning. I don't think I ever did it directly, but maybe my son did pick up some indirect mentorship from some of the guys that I've served with. I'm just from being in a military upbringing. But again, to answer your question directly, I think it is value just to have a variety of perspectives. If he only kind of knows one grown man's example, there's nothing to say that that's the best one. So not to say the more the merrier, but a few more could be beneficial, I think.
Yeah, my own experience with that is kind of interesting because my mom kind of forced that on me. She sent me to work with my uncle at a ranch there in Kemmer, Wyoming. I never had a choice. I had to go. And then my junior in high school, she made me go live with another uncle who was in Europe at the time. He was in the Army. And I think she saw that for whatever reason, she made those decisions. I never had a choice. I don't know that I remember arguing, but I didn't have a choice. But she didn't do that with my brother, who's younger than me. He never had, that type of experience where he was kind of forced to go do stuff like that. And I don't know that I call either of my uncles necessarily mentors. I never called them after, to seek life advice or anything with them. But those were both those experiences were really foundational, I think, in how I grew up, were big impacts on my life. So that's an interesting idea, I think, of making your kid go do something like that. In this case, another man, and getting away from the house. Anything else on this idea? Let's go on. I think there's another section here I think that was interesting. The impact of our fathers on our own parenting. There's this idea in here that the term father hunger. I thought that was really interesting, this father hunger. I don't know if you can speak to that. Maybe you can, Dan. And you said you had plenty of mentors, Charlie. A father hunger, a deep emotional need for a positive father figure, often driving a boatman to seek healing through their own fathering. In other words, you want to be a better father because your dad maybe wasn't a good father, or you want to maybe not be a better father, but improve upon the job he did because you just want to do that. Any thoughts about this idea of father hunger from anybody? Just go ahead and jump in.
I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
I think it's certainly true, right? Particularly, I mean, the last 50 years worth of generations is kind of the first real generations to experience divorce at scale. It just wasn't a common thing prior to. So there's probably more kids with absent fathers versus before, maybe. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think generally you get that example of, it kind of sucks, right? My parents split when I was very young, so I never knew it any different. But when you see, perhaps you're with your kid and you're with friends and, they've got a whole family unit, you're like, oh, that looks pretty cool. Versus not. So I think that certainly leaves an impact, and once puts a desire in yourself to be a little bit more deliberate about being around and being there physically and emotionally.
Yeah, I'll say that I, without a doubt, have been driven to be the father that I didn't think my dad was. I mean, just to put it in perspective, it's cheesy, but maybe it'll make sense. Before battalion command, you get your name on a sign. And on my father's side, tradition has been that the son takes your father's first name becomes your son's middle name, which I've done with my son as well. And the sign for my name under the unit headquarters, I said I don't want my middle initial on there. So the only thing I said coming is I don't want to be associated with it. He just passed away too, so it was just kind of like I'm still pissed at him for stuff he did when I was in third grade. So it's very real, this hunger to not do the same mistakes that they made, and to right that ship with your kid, with your son specifically.
That's powerful. Derek, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'd say coming from the positive aspect too, it's like kind of, for me, it's been living up to my dad's example in some ways of giving me that hunger to be there as well and do the things that I know that I can and should do, and kind of prioritizing my efforts in the right ways. And then also seeing kind of some of the ways that I'd like to improve from my upbringing as well. So the hunger's real.
Yeah.
I like this idea of the modeling aspect of it, and you've all spoken to that a little bit. I wonder about, as I think about modeling, I kind of think about risk taking. In other words, I've taken a lot of career risk in my life, and still am. And just the idea of going out there and taking that risk is kind of interesting. I have sons in their 30s and some kids in their 9 or younger, and neither of my older boys are real risk takers. And I was kind of wondering, well, they're so different than me. I guess you can't expect that. But just that idea, of adventure, physical adventure, but also maybe occupational adventure as an element of modeling. For me, that's the modeling I think I hope that is coming across to them. I remember when I got out of the Coast Guard, or decided to get out of the Coast Guard. I was young and broke and had a kid. And my mom said, whatever you do, make it exciting. She didn't say make it fun. She was like, make it exciting. And I thought that was an interesting thing. Maybe that stuck with me. In terms of modeling for you, for your kids, what's the most important element of modeling as a father that each of you has? For me, it's kind of this risk taking. Go ahead, Charlie. That's a hard one.
Well, do you mean traits that you hope they emulate, or traits that I mean, I guess it's not something you can force, but could you explain a little bit better?
I guess so. I guess you'd have to say traits that that you hope they emulate, or maybe that you do, hoping that they see it.
Yeah. I would kind of go back to Dan's one of Dan's points, which is how you treat your relationship with your wife. I think that's just so important, and it's going to kind of set the standard for how probably how he looks at women generally, right? And I mean, I'm glad he didn't see me in my in my 20s, but I think he's got a good example now, and I think that's just so important, particularly because ultimately, to me, I think those family relationships are going to be the most important thing in your life throughout your life, and being able to set an example of being a good, kind husband is a really important thing to set in terms of how he approaches the opposite sex for his lifetime.
Dan.
Yeah, go back to what we said at the beginning of what we ranked as our top 3 responsibilities. Because when I hear modeling, I think example setting. And for me, I think it's service. So, like, in other words, having an intrinsic, if your son has an intrinsic want to serve something greater than himself and was able to see that through the father's example, I think that's where I would see the most important thing for modeling. I think that would guide them to just be generally a better person, a better citizen, if that's done right.
Derek.
Yeah, I guess I hope my kids see and can understand kind of the work ethic that goes into being a fully functioning adult, and then the effort. I want them to see that it's good to try, even if you're not the best at something, and to like continue putting in the work ethic and the grit that comes along with that. And I want to show them examples and give them opportunities to do so.
You're all aware of the recent research that's come out with boys and issues that boys are having in America, social media driven, whatever is going on. But I'm really concerned about that. And not too sure how to address it. One of the things that I heard recently, and I hope to bring it back on as a good friend, he heard this from another friend, but his friend had taken his son out of school between middle school and freshman year in high school, out of school for a year. It's like a gap year, and they just did kind of guy stuff together. They did, but I hope to do this with my younger sons coming up. But like 6 weeks in the fall elk hunting, right? 6 weeks in the winter skiing someplace. 6 weeks in the spring, just hanging out, surfing, rock climbing, doing something. For me, it's all outside stuff, right? Maybe for you, it's travel or something like that. And then in the spring and summer, long backpacking trip. But just kind of getting them out and kind of doing kind of guy stuff together. Maybe the fight technology. This individual has been able to do that. He's a fireman, and so he's kind of worked his career, and he did it with his daughter, coming up. I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. To me, I see that as, great maybe for the kid, but also for me, right? I read once that when I grew up, I want to be a little boy. And like my kids now, they're like forced friends, right? I make them do stuff that I want to do that I think is fun, and they come along. So just going back to the idea of any thoughts or special concern that you have about, you all have sons, right? Your sons, and maybe the way that's changed your thoughts about fatherhood given the data that we kind of see. Anyone can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a tough deal, right? I mean, I'm not sure what the root cause of it is. I think probably girls are in worse shape than boys are. At least that's kind of the data that I've seen, particularly as it relates to social media stuff, just the impact on young women, but it certainly impacts young men too.
I guess I point out if you take a look at like college graduation rates, high school academic success, those types of things, at least the data has shown that there's issues with men now. So go ahead. That was the context.
Yeah. I don't doubt it. And you certainly see it. It's always interesting being a parent and kind of observing other kids, particularly older kids in my own, because, you're just kind of, you're seeing what the field looks like, essentially. There's a lot of different routes that a kid can go. I don't know what the right answer is there. That's kind of why I've have been thinking about being pretty deliberate on male mentorship, that kind of stuff outside of the family unit, because I think there are some real big benefits to that. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, Rob and I, we've kind of talked about this before, and one of my, I don't know when it happens, but certainly a goal of mine is to kind of set up a training facility. I've been involved in various combat sports stuff for a long time, and I trained at a boxing gym in Charleston, South Carolina. That was really in a tough part of the neighborhood, and I was certainly the only white boy in there. And a lot of these kids came from fucked up family environments, home environments. But you saw the impact of what this place did for these kids. And it was, there was 10-year-olds in there, and there were grown men in there, all training side by side. So there was this kind of wonderful example of work ethic and dedication in a physical outlet that I think really impacted those kids, because they all, like, every single one of those kids who stuck around went and did something good after they got out of high school. One, they finished high school, and two, they did something good afterwards, whether it was going to college or joining the military, whatever the case may be. And I attribute their success to this space, this dedicated space where they are able to kind of harness their own thing, right, and take it and apply it to life. I think it's definitely a problem. I'm not sure what the right answer is, but it seems like being able to establish something that kind of that tribe concept outside of the family, I think is really could be very important for young men. And you see this all over the world, right? I mean, the biggest thing, I'll be quick on this, but a friend of mine did his graduate thesis at Harvard on kind of what are the driving factors behind terrorism recruitment in the Sahel. And the thing that he found to be the biggest was disenfranchisement, right? Not able to find a job. There's like local economic impacts and stuff like that for sure that drive this, but disenfranchisement was the biggest factor that he found in his research, going there and spending quite a lot of time there. And so I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but maybe there's some small solutions that can help it.
Yeah, this is, I'm all over the place on this one, but what I think I'd like to start off by saying is I didn't realize how thankful I was that my son literally grew up his entire life on military installations. We never lived off base ever throughout from his entire life. And when he went off to college, I was scared to death. He was going to the city of Cleveland, Ohio. And I was like, man, how the hell is he going to adjust to this? And one, credit to my son for being resilient, because he's obviously still doing well. But second thing is his mind was blown by the behaviors of people he was going to school with, whether that was cleanliness, organization. Like his first roommate, it was a non-starter. His place was so disgusting. He didn't even move in. We had to get him a separate apartment because it was so disgusting and undisciplined. So I'm wondering how much, I think Derek mentioned earlier, like the social aspect, how much of the current problem is just a lack of face-to-face interaction. You have your social media, you got your phones, but how much might be lacking in terms of somebody growing up and not having if they don't have the luxury that he had of being on an installation where everybody was still in a community and still interacted more, or a father to force that upon the kid growing up to be more socially interactive, that it's causing these problems with graduation rates or people seeking out the wrong type of groups. This is a tough one. This is fascinating. I don't know. I'm all over the place.
Yeah, I think on social media specifically, it doesn't give kids time to get away from whatever is going on at school or whatever's going on with a certain group of people, and just always being able to be reached, I think is negatively impacting our kids. I don't know if it's more so boys or girls. I think it's just everybody. And then the fact that people see it as connection, when I don't think it does the same thing for us. Of course, being in the military, like Dan, we got friends all over the world. You're constantly on the group chats, and you have calls and everything, and it's really important and really great staying in touch. But nothing beats being shoulder to shoulder with somebody and actually having face-to-face conversations. And I've seen a huge lack of that actually happening with teenagers and even younger. And so I think if it keeps going that way of more electronic contact vice more physical contact, that we'll continue seeing some of the same issues.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm fucking terrified about what the next 10 years brings with this technological revolution. It's going to be a whole, I mean, I don't know if you're following Meta's business news, but I mean, their whole business model is shifting or pivoting to these AI driven bots that are created to be like people, right? So it's this virtual relationship with a AI model. I mean, how the fuck do you approach that problem, right? I mean, it's terrifying.
It scares the shit out of me. The only optimism I have is that God, I can't remember where I read it, but somebody mentioned that there is the potential that it gets to a point where the AI or whatever things are, they've seated themselves in one aspect of business, community, etc., and we're going to see a resurgence of need for blue collar type work and employment and labor, and actually, being able to have a sustained, a healthy, profitable lifestyle with blue collar industrial skills. I don't have anything further to support that, but if I'm trying to be optimistic and reduce my level of anxiety for the future, I try to look at that.
Yeah, I can tell you that just, I don't know about you, Dan. I'm older than you are. I got 10 years on you, I think, or more. As a, first lieutenant or Lieutenant JG in the Coast Guard, I guess, captain or lieutenant or captain, I guess would be equivalent in the Army. I was able to buy a house in Juneau, Alaska. And on my income, my wife didn't really have any income. And when that was my first, non-ship duty station. And so I was in my early 20s and able to buy a house. And boy, it's just impossible now. So things have definitely changed just from that perspective with inflation or whatever. And salaries haven't kept up. So yeah, I really am worried about the future from that perspective. And the occupational thing is crazy. I hope that works out. Yeah, I do have one son who's, he's a strength coach for me, and the older son, the other son's, on his way to become an electrician. One was, academic, and the other wasn't, out of high school. They kind of self-chose that, but I think they're both hopefully set. Instead of, we're about ready to wrap up here. Instead of going through all the lightning round questions again, which is original plan, just anybody after this conversation, would you change any answers significantly after our conversation, or did the conversation kind of reinforce where you were?
Yeah, I'll just jump.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Charlie.
Good. No, go, Dan.
The only thing I was going to say that I don't think anything significantly changed. It was mostly reinforcement, but the two things that I have modified here is a greater need for presence as it goes versus provision. In other words, at the start of this, I was heavy in the responsibility of being a provider, and it still exists, but I think presence is more, I give presence more weight than I did originally. Just simple presence, I think, has more weight than I did originally. And then the second thing was the aspect of, it was Charlie's question, I guess, about the seeking out other mentors for your, specifically in the grade school, high school areas, other male mentors for your son. I actually think is more important than I would have ever considered. Kind of reflecting on that one. So those are the two things that modified or changed for me throughout.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I would say reinforced. I think we're all pretty much along the same lines on this. I'm kind of the opinion that being a good dad is a pass-fail event. It's not necessarily on a scale. I'm much more in the nature camp of the nature versus nurture. And you just see this with kids. I only have one kid, right? But you see this with, my friends who have multiple kids. They could be so different, right? I mean, and that seems to be the rule generally. And so I think if you can put those foundational elements in, do the best you can, be there emotionally and physically, the rest is kind of up to them.
Yeah, the final question. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just real quick. I think one of the things that helped me kind of answer is mostly reinforced, but a different way of thinking through the importance of connection and relationship versus calling it like an emotional availability or whatever it is. So kind of delineating those lines and helping think through some of the different scenarios that happens in.
It's such a charged term, isn't it?
Yeah.
It sounds like I don't know. It always feels like even weird saying those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's like in a strength conditioning world, when I see something that's, mobility or flexibility, I take a step back. It's formal. that kind of brings me back, I guess, this idea. I think, the presence thing. Last year, I took my young son, the two of us, up to Alaska, just a week, just two of us fishing, and first couple days, but by day three, it was pretty amazing, and I really didn't try to do anything emotional. It's not like we had deep talks or anything, but it was pretty cool. I think, and that's really important, just that kind of time. The final question here, and it's not a question that we can answer, but I want to know what you think about how this could be answered. And that's, are you a good dad? Are you a good dad? And I don't know that we can answer that, right? And so our kids have to answer for us. But when do they answer? I mean, is it your 16-year-old daughter? Probably not. Or your 6-year-old son. But is it their 30-year-old son? Right? Is Dan still pissed at his dad, right? So he's in his 40s. What do you think about that idea of when? Is it your wife that answers? Is it your kids that answer? And when do you get that answer? Or are you a good dad, or were you a good dad? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is kind of a pass-fail event too. I think if, your kid, if you're terminally sick, right, you're on your deathbed in some variety and your child comes to see you, you probably did all right. If they're not there, you didn't.
Interesting answer. Dan?
I think maybe to your first part about when do you answer that, it would come like the most accurate way to answer would be like maybe when your son is on his deathbed as a grown man. In other words, like you don't know if you've been good until their lifespan is coming complete, to see how they continued on throughout their entire life. And I do think it's the kid that answers it. It has to be the son that answers that question, but I'm stuck on your part about when do you answer whether or not you were a good dad.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's kind of answering the question about you all the time, it seems like, right? And they're going to come to different responses throughout their lifespan or their perspective or what's going on. And I think what it really comes down to is later on in life, once they've had the ability to see and experience life and maybe even have sons of their own, they get a whole different type of perspective.
All right, fellas, that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us this morning. Hard questions. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
Appreciate you guys. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.